Emma's small hand pressed against the frosted window, her breath creating small clouds as she squinted through the swirling snow. That's when she saw it. A dark shape against the white, something that shouldn't be there. "Stop the car!" she screamed, her voice piercing the quiet hum of the engine. Mark slammed on the brakes, the vehicle fishtailing dangerously on the ice-slicked road. "There's a dog out there!" Emma was already fumbling with her seatbelt, that tiny fingers trembling with urgency. Through the thickening blizzard, the German Shepherd's silhouette became clearer, a once majestic animal now slumped against a tree trunk, ice crusting its fur, a rope cutting into its neck. "It's dying," Emma whispered, tears instantly freezing on her cheeks. The temperature display read -27 degrees. The dog's eyes, barely open, met hers through the window. In that fractured moment, something passed between them. A desperate, final plea from a creature who had given up hope. What happened next would shake a town to its core, expose a darkness no one wanted to acknowledge, and prove that sometimes the smallest hands can carry the greatest courage. Because 6-year-old Emma Wilson was about to change everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. 6-year-old Emma Wilson hadn't spoken more than a dozen words since her mother's funeral 3 weeks ago. The car accident had left her not just motherless, but seemingly voiceless, her small world shattered into fragments no adult could properly reassemble. Now, she was being transported through one of Minnesota's worst winter storms to the only relative who could take her, a grandfather she barely knew. Emma clutched her worn stuffed rabbit, her only remaining connection to before, while staring out at the endless white landscape. What no one understood was that Emma's silence wasn't emptiness, but observation. She watched everything with eyes that missed nothing, especially when it came to animals. Last summer, she had nursed a fallen robin back to health when everyone said it would die. When her neighbor's cat went missing, Emma had found it trapped in an abandoned well. Animals spoke a language Emma understood better than human words, especially now that her mother's voice was gone forever. The northern Minnesota landscape seemed to mirror Emma's internal state, harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in its desolation. Timber Lake was a community of barely 2,000 souls, clinging to existence despite the lumber mill's closure 3 years prior. Weathered storefronts with "for lease" signs lined Main Street, and pickup trucks older than Emma herself navigated the snow-covered roads. Beneath the picture postcard winter scene lay economic desperation that had twisted some residents toward secretive ways of making money, creating an undercurrent few acknowledged openly. The blizzard now engulfing the region had cut off the already isolated town from outside help, turning it into an island of snow and secrets. Mark Peterson gripped the steering wheel of his SUV tighter, regretting his agreement to drive the child as a favor to a friend of a friend. At 42, the construction worker had little experience with children, and even less with grief. His own troubled past gave him enough burdens without adding a traumatized child to his conscience. Thomas Wilson, Emma's grandfather, was hardly better equipped for sudden guardianship. Once the town's respected veterinarian, the 70-year-old man had retreated into near hermitage after his own series of tragedies. Sheriff Robert Miller maintained an iron grip on the town's affairs through selective enforcement and strategic blindness, while Dr. Sarah Johnson stood as a rare voice of compassion at the small local clinic, the only healthcare for 20 miles in any direction. The ancient SUV struggled against the mounting snowdrifts, its headlights barely penetrating the white curtain that had descended over Highway 23. Mark Peterson hunched forward, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The radio had long since faded to static, leaving only the howl of wind and the rhythmic swish of wipers, fighting a losing battle against the accumulating snow. In the passenger seat, Emma sat with her small backpack clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the hypnotic dance of snowflakes in the headlight beams. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the social worker's office in Duluth 3 hours ago, and Mark had given up trying to make conversation. The silence hung between them, thick as the snow outside. "Should be about 20 more minutes to your grandfather's place," Mark muttered, more to himself than to Emma. "If this storm doesn't bury us first." He checked the fuel gauge nervously. Half a tank should be enough, but if they got stuck, he pushed the thought away and focused on the nearly invisible road ahead. Emma's thoughts drifted like the snow. Memories of her mother flickered through her mind, warm hands braiding her hair, the smell of cinnamon pancakes on Sunday mornings, soft singing during thunderstorms when Emma couldn't sleep. Now those memories were all she had. Fragments to clutch at, while being delivered to a stranger who happened to share her blood. Her social worker had shown her a photograph, an old man with a stern face and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. "Your grandfather," she'd said, as if that word should mean something to Emma. Her mother had rarely spoken of him. The SUV hit a patch of ice, sliding sideways before Mark regained control. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice tight with tension. Emma didn't respond, her gaze now fixed on the dark line of trees that bordered the highway. Something about their looming presence made her uneasy, as if secrets lurked in the spaces between their snow-laden branches. It was then that Emma saw something that didn't belong, a darker shadow among the trees, oddly shaped and unmoving. She pressed her face against the cold window, squinting to see through the swirling snow. As they passed, the headlights briefly illuminated the shape, and Emma's heart stopped. A dog, a large dog, tied to a tree, its form nearly covered in snow. Its head hung low, but Emma could see it was a German shepherd, like the one her neighbor Mrs. Lawson had owned back home. "Stop!" Emma's voice, unused for so long, exploded in the confined space of the vehicle. "Stop the car! There's a dog back there." Mark jumped at the sudden sound, then processed her words. "What, kid? We can't stop in this." "Please." Emma's voice broke, tears suddenly streaming down her face. "It's tied up. It's going to die." Mark hesitated, looking in the rearview mirror at the wall of white behind them. Every instinct told him to keep going. They were already behind schedule, the storm was worsening by the minute, and his responsibility was to deliver this child safely to her grandfather. Stopping on this deserted stretch of highway during a blizzard was madness. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice dropping to a desperate plea. "Please." Something in her voice, perhaps the raw emotion from a child who had shown none until now, made Mark curse under his breath and carefully pump the brakes. The SUV slid slightly before coming to a stop on the snow-covered shoulder. "Stay in the car," he ordered, zipping his jacket up to his chin and pulling on thick gloves. "I'll check it out." But Emma was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'm coming too." It wasn't a request. Mark wanted to argue, but the determination in the small girl's eyes told him it would be futile. "Fine, but stay close to me, and if I say we leave, we leave. Understand?" Emma nodded, already pulling on her pink knit hat. They stepped out into a world gone white and wild, the wind immediately stealing their breath away. Snow pelted their faces like tiny needles, and the cold cut through their clothing with vicious efficiency. Mark took Emma's hand, and together they trudged back along the road, following their vehicle's rapidly disappearing tracks. It took them nearly 5 minutes to reach the spot Emma had indicated, fighting against the wind and knee-deep snow. At first, Mark thought she had imagined it. There was nothing but trees and snow, but then Emma pulled free from his grip and plunged toward the tree line. "Emma, wait," he called, struggling to keep up with the surprisingly agile child. She stopped abruptly at a large pine tree, dropping to her knees beside a mound of snow. As Mark caught up, breathing heavily, he realized with a shock that the mound was indeed a dog. A large German shepherd, nearly covered by snowfall. A thick rope bound it to the tree trunk, the knot frozen solid and crusted with ice. The dog's eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow and labored. "Who would do this?" Emma whispered, her small hand already brushing snow from the dog's matted fur. The animal made no response to her touch, too far gone in its suffering to register human contact. Mark knelt beside her, assessing the situation with growing alarm. The dog was clearly near death, its body temperature dangerously low. The rope had frozen into the fur around its neck, and ice crystals had formed on its muzzle and eyelashes. This wasn't a dog that had accidentally gotten loose and tangled. Someone had deliberately tied it to this tree and left it to die a slow, agonizing death. "We need to get it free," Emma said, her voice suddenly clear and commanding despite the howling wind. "Do you have a knife?" Mark nodded. pulling out his pocket knife. As he began sawing at the frozen rope, Emma pressed her small body against the dog's side, trying to share what warmth she could. Her tears fell silently onto the animal's fur, creating tiny melted droplets that immediately began to refreeze. "You're going to be okay," she whispered into the dog's ear. "I promise. I'm not leaving you here." The rope finally gave way under Mark's knife, releasing the dog from its frozen prison. Emma immediately wrapped her small arms around the German Shepherd's neck, her tears falling onto its ice-crusted fur. The animal made no movement, save for the shallow rise and fall of its chest, evidence that life still clung to its emaciated frame, the thinnest of threads. "We need to get him warm," Emma said, her voice suddenly authoritative despite her small stature. Mark nodded, carefully sliding his arms beneath the large dog. He was surprised at how light it felt, clearly undernourished, its muscle mass diminished. The dog's head lolled against his shoulder, its eyes barely opening as Mark lifted it from its snowy grave. "Come on, kid. Back to the car, fast." The wind had intensified, driving the snow horizontally into their faces. Emma trudged ahead, breaking a path through the deepening snow, repeatedly looking back to check on the dog in Mark's arms. The few hundred feet back to the vehicle felt like miles as they battled the elements, their exposed skin burning with cold. By the time they reached the SUV, Mark's arms ached and Emma's face had gone alarmingly red from the biting wind. He managed to open the rear door one-handed, gently laying the German Shepherd across the back seat. Emma immediately climbed in beside it, removing her own coat to drape over the trembling animal. "Emma, you need to keep your coat on," Mark protested, but the determined set of the child's jaw told him the argument was already lost. He cranked the heater to maximum and retrieved an emergency blanket from under the passenger seat, passing it back to Emma. "Use this too, and put your coat back on under it. You can't help the dog if you get hypothermia." She nodded reluctantly, rewrapping herself while keeping as much of the thermal blanket over the dog as possible. Mark watched in the rearview mirror as she began gently rubbing the dog's legs and paws, trying to stimulate blood flow without causing the pain that too rapid rewarming might bring. Where had a 6-year-old learned about treating cold exposure? He shook his head and turned his attention back to the road ahead. They needed to reach Thomas Wilson's place quickly. The dog needed proper care beyond what they could provide in a car. Mark shifted into drive, the tires spinning momentarily before finding purchase. The SUV lurched forward into the swirling whiteness, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the intensifying storm. They had gone less than half a mile when the vehicle began to shudder, the steering wheel pulling sharply to the right. No, Mark muttered, fighting to keep the SUV on the increasingly invisible road. A violent gust of wind caught them broadside, and suddenly they were sliding, rotating slightly as the rear end lost traction. Mark instinctively turned into the skid, but it was too late. The vehicle left the roadway and plunged into a deep snowdrift with a sickening crunch. The sudden stop threw Emma forward against her seatbelt, though she managed to keep the dog from sliding off the seat. "Are we stuck?" she asked, her voice small again with fear. Mark tried reversing, then driving forward, but the wheels merely spun uselessly, digging them deeper into the snow. He thumped the steering wheel in frustration before cutting the engine to conserve fuel. "Yeah, we're stuck." He turned to look at Emma and the dog. "But we've got half a tank of gas, so we can stay warm while I figure this out." He stepped out into the blizzard, the wind nearly knocking him off his feet. The SUV had veered off the road and into a ditch, its front end buried in snow up to the headlights. Even if he had brought a shovel, digging out in these conditions would be nearly impossible. Mark circled the vehicle, assessing their predicament with growing concern. They were trapped, at least until the storm passed or someone happened by, neither of which seemed likely to occur soon. Back in the vehicle, Emma had positioned herself so the dog's head rested in her lap. She was gently stroking its ears, whispering words of encouragement that the animal seemed too weak to acknowledge. "He's getting colder again," she said, as Mark slid back into the driver's seat, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. "I'll keep the engine running for heat, but we need to be careful with the gas," Mark explained, brushing snow from his coat. "If we run out..." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what running out of gas would mean in this weather. Emma continued to comfort the dog, while Mark repeatedly tried to get a signal on his cell phone. Nothing. They were in a dead zone, miles from the nearest cell tower, cut off from communication in the heart of the blizzard. He retrieved a flashlight from the glove compartment and studied the map he'd been given. Thomas Wilson's property should be about 5 miles ahead, an impossible distance to walk in these conditions under normal circumstances, let alone with a child and a dying dog. As if reading his thoughts, Emma spoke up from the back seat. "We can't stay here. He's going to die if we don't get help." Her voice wavered, but held determination beyond her years. Mark was about to argue when he spotted something through the swirling snow, a faint, yellowish glow in the distance. It could be a house, perhaps a half-mile across the fields to their right. It might not be Thomas Wilson's place, but any shelter would be better than slowly freezing in a stranded vehicle with dwindling fuel. "Emma, I think I see a light over there," he said, pointing. "It might be a house where we can get help." Emma leaned forward, squinting through the snow-covered window. "I see it," she confirmed, her voice lifting with hope. "We have to try." Mark weighed their options, none of them good. Stay with the vehicle and hope for rescue that might never come, or risk crossing open terrain in a blizzard with a small child and a severely injured dog. The responsible choice seemed obvious, yet the dog's labored breathing and Emma's pleading eyes tilted the scales. "Okay," he said finally, "but we need to prepare properly. It's going to be dangerous out there." They worked quickly, wrapping the dog in the thermal blanket and Mark's extra jacket. Mark found a length of rope in his emergency kit. The cruel irony of using rope to save a dog that had been victimized by it wasn't lost on him, and fashioned a crude harness to distribute the animal's weight across his back. Emma put on every layer she had, her small frame nearly disappearing beneath the bulk of clothing. "Stay right beside me," Mark instructed as they prepared to leave the relative safety of the vehicle. "If you can't go on, you tell me immediately. Promise?" Emma nodded solemnly, her eyes fixed on the German Shepherd now secured to Mark's back. "I promise." She took a deep breath, squared her tiny shoulders, and added with unexpected fierceness, "But I won't give up. Not on him." Mark nodded, respecting the child's determination despite his misgivings. With one last look at the stranded SUV, he opened the door and they stepped out together into the howling white void, guided only by the distant promise of light. The journey across the open field was a brutal test of endurance. Each step plunged them knee-deep into snow, the wind hurling ice crystals that stung like tiny razors against any exposed skin. Mark felt the dog's weight growing heavier with every labored step, while Emma trudged beside him, occasionally disappearing into snowdrifts that reached her waist. She never complained, not once, her small face set with determination beyond her years. The distant light seemed to taunt them, appearing no closer despite their painful progress. "Almost there," Mark lied, his voice barely audible above the wind. He'd been saying the same thing for what felt like hours, but might have been only 20 minutes. Time lost meaning in the white void surrounding them. Emma didn't respond, focusing all her energy on placing one foot in front of the other. Her pink hat was now white with accumulated snow, her eyelashes frosted. Mark fought rising panic. He had made a terrible mistake bringing a child out into this killing cold. The responsible thing would have been to stay with the vehicle. When Emma stumbled and fell face first into the snow, Mark's heart nearly stopped. He reached down awkwardly, hampered by the dog strapped to his back, and pulled her up. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. "Emma, we need to go back," he shouted over the wind. "No." She pointed ahead with a mittened hand. "We're almost there. Look." The light had indeed grown stronger, and now Mark could make out the dark shape of a building, a large cabin or small house with a covered porch. Relief flooded through him, giving his exhausted muscles one last surge of energy. "You're right. Come on, just a little further." They staggered the final 100 yards, the snow mercifully shallower as they approached the structure. It was a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, a miraculous sight in the middle of this frozen wilderness. Light spilled from frost-covered windows, promising warmth and safety within. Mark pounded on the door with a numb fist, his other arm supporting Emma, who swayed beside him like a sapling in the wind. "Hello. Please, we need help." Long seconds passed. Mark was about to knock again when the door swung open, revealing a tall, gaunt man with a shock of white hair and a face weathered by decades of harsh winters. Thomas Wilson's eyes widened as he took in the scene before him, a half-frozen man with a large dog strapped to his back and a small, snow-covered child who could barely stand. "Dear God," he muttered, stepping back. "Get in here, quickly." They stumbled across the threshold into blessed warmth, the contrast so sudden it was almost painful. The cabin's interior was rustic but comfortable, dominated by a large stone fireplace where logs crackled and spat. Worn leather furniture, bookshelves packed with volumes, and a scatter of throw rugs created an atmosphere of lived-in coziness at odds with the stern countenance of the man who'd admitted them. "You must be Mark Peterson," Thomas said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "And this?" His gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it fell on Emma. "This must be my granddaughter." Emma looked up at him with exhausted eyes but said nothing, her attention immediately returning to the dog as Mark carefully lowered it onto a rug near the fire. "What in heaven's name possessed you to cross those fields in this storm?" Thomas demanded, helping Mark remove the improvised harness. "And what's this?" He gestured to the dog, now lying motionless on the floor, its breathing shallow and labored. "We found him tied to a tree, left to die," Emma said quietly, kneeling beside the animal and placing a small hand on its head. "We had to save him." Something flickered across Thomas's face, recognition perhaps, or alarm. It was gone so quickly Mark thought he might have imagined it. The old man bent down, his movements suddenly professional as he examined the dog with practiced hands. "This animal is severely hypothermic and malnourished," he said, his tone shifting to clinical detachment. "And these marks around the neck," he frowned, parting the fur to reveal raw, abraded skin beneath. "Consistent with long-term restraint, not just a few hours tied to a tree." Mark and Emma exchanged glances. "You sound like you know what you're talking about," Mark observed. Thomas straightened up with a slight grimace, as if his knees protested the movement. "I was a veterinarian for 40 years before I retired. Ironic that you should bring a dying animal to my doorstep." He moved to a cabinet and began pulling out supplies. Blankets, a first aid kit, various bottles and instruments. "Can you help him?" Emma asked, her voice small but insistent. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "I can try." What followed was a flurry of activity as Thomas directed their efforts to save the German Shepherd. Emma was put to work holding warm compresses against the dog's paws and belly, while Mark assisted Thomas with administering fluids and medication. The old man worked with sure, efficient movements that belied his age, muttering instructions and observations as if he'd never left his practice. As they worked, Emma never once left the dog's side, speaking to it in soft, encouraging tones. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you again." The animal's eyes occasionally flickered open, fixing on her face with what seemed like recognition, before closing again in exhaustion. Hours passed, the blizzard continuing to rage outside while they fought their own battle within. Finally, Thomas sat back on his heels, wiping his brow with a forearm. "We've done what we can for now," he announced. "His temperature is up, he's hydrated, and I've treated the wounds I can see. The rest is up to him." He looked at Emma, who was still stroking the dog's head gently. "He's a fighter, I'll give him that. Not many animals would survive what he's been through." "What happened to him?" Emma asked, looking up at her grandfather. "Why would someone tie him up and leave him there?" Thomas's expression hardened. "Some questions are better left unasked in these parts, child." He stood up, his knees cracking audibly. "You two need food and rest. The dog will be fine here by the fire." "His name is Max," Emma said suddenly. Thomas paused. "How do you know that?" "I just do," she replied with the simple certainty of a child. "He told me." Thomas and Mark exchanged glances, but neither contradicted her. Names were important, especially to children, and if calling the dog Max gave Emma comfort, there was no harm in it. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of hot soup, warm blankets, and exhausted, fractured conversation. Thomas was not effusive, but he proved a capable host, ensuring his unexpected guests had everything they needed. Mark called the social worker from Thomas's landline, explaining their situation and assuring her that Emma was safe. The storm, according to the weather report, would continue through the night, but should clear by morning. Emma insisted on sleeping on the floor next to Max, wrapped in blankets beside the fire. Neither man had the heart to argue with her. Mark took the couch, while Thomas retired to his bedroom, though the thin walls of the cabin carried the sound of his restless movements well into the night. Dawn brought watery sunlight, and a landscape transformed. The blizzard had moved on, leaving behind a pristine white world that sparkled under the morning light. Emma was the first to wake, immediately checking on Max. The dog's condition had improved overnight. His breathing was stronger, and when Emma placed her hand on his side, his tail thumped weakly against the floor. "Good morning, Max," she whispered, and was rewarded with the dog's eyes opening, focusing on her face with newfound clarity. Emma smiled, her first real smile since her mother's death. Thomas emerged from his bedroom, already dressed, and raised an eyebrow at the scene. "Well, look who decided to stick around," he commented, kneeling to examine the dog. "Remarkable recovery considering his condition yesterday. He just needed someone to believe in him," Emma said, her hand never leaving the dog's fur. "Perhaps," Thomas conceded, his expression softening fractionally. "Let's get him some food and water, see if he'll take it." To their surprise, Max managed to rise shakily to his feet and lap at the water bowl Thomas provided. He even consumed a small amount of food, a special mixture Thomas prepared that would be gentle on his system after near starvation. His legs trembled with the effort of standing, but the improvement from the previous day was nothing short of miraculous. As Thomas prepared breakfast for the humans, Emma made a discovery that changed everything. While gently brushing debris from Max's fur, her fingers encountered something metallic beneath the thick ruff around his neck. Carefully parting the matted hair, she found a small metal tag that had been hidden beneath layers of fur. "Grandpa," she called excitedly, "look what I found." Thomas and Mark both approached as Emma held up her discovery. It was a police canine identification tag, partially obscured by dried mud but still legible. "Max," Thomas read aloud, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Well, you got his name right at least." "He's a police dog?" Mark asked, taking the tag for a closer look. "Canine Unit, Timber County Sheriff's Department. Handler, Deputy J. Williams." Thomas's face darkened. "That's not possible," he muttered. "James Williams died in an accident 6 months ago." "You knew him?" Mark asked. "Everyone in Timber Lake knew James," Thomas replied, his voice tight. "He was one of the few honest men in the sheriff's department. His death was convenient for some." Emma looked between the two men, sensing the sudden tension. "What does that mean?" she asked. "Why would someone hurt a police dog?" Thomas seemed to remember she was present and moderated his tone. "Sometimes, animals see things people would rather keep hidden," he said carefully. "A trained police dog, especially one belonging to a deputy who might have been asking uncomfortable questions. Well, that could be a problem for certain individuals." Mark frowned. "Are you saying what I think you're saying? That this dog was deliberately targeted?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Emma, why don't you stay with Max while Mark and I talk in the kitchen?" Emma nodded, sensing the adult conversation that was about to take place, but content to remain with her new friend. As the men moved away, she leaned close to Max's ear. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I won't let anyone hurt you again. We're going to find out who did this." In the kitchen, Thomas spoke in low, urgent tones. "This isn't the first animal I've seen abandoned like this," he confessed. "Over the past year, there have been others. Mostly dogs, some cats. Always tied up and left in remote areas to die slowly." "And nobody's investigated?" Mark asked incredulously. "Sheriff Miller claims they're just strays or runaways," Thomas replied with a grimace. "But I know better. The restraint marks, the deliberate placement far from roads or houses, these animals were meant to suffer before they died, and they all had one thing in common. Their owners had somehow crossed certain powerful people in this county." "What kind of monster does that to an animal?" "The human kind," Thomas said grimly. "The same kind that makes sure nosy deputies have accidents on icy roads." Mark glanced back toward the living room, where Emma sat with Max. So this dog might be connected to James Williams's death? I don't know, Thomas admitted. But finding a police canine tied to a tree to die months after his handler's suspicious death? That's not coincidence. We should call the state police, Mark suggested. Thomas laughed bitterly. With what evidence? A half-dead dog and an old man's suspicions? Sheriff Miller has the county board in his pocket. Any outside investigation would hit barriers before it began. So we do nothing? Mark demanded, his voice rising slightly. I didn't say that, Thomas replied. But we need to be smart about this, and we need to keep Emma out of it. She's been through enough already. As if summoned by her name, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her small face alight with excitement. Max stood up by himself, she announced, and he's wagging his tail. Come see. The men followed her back to the living room, where Max had indeed risen to his feet. Though still weak, the German Shepherd stood with more confidence now, his tail moving in a slow but deliberate wag as he watched Emma approach. Well done, Max, Thomas said, genuine warmth creeping into his voice for the first time. He knelt beside the dog, examining him with professional eyes. He's stronger than I expected. Good nutrition, proper care, he could make a full recovery. Emma beamed at this news, throwing her arms around the dog's neck in a gentle hug. Max responded by licking her cheek, a gesture that brought tears to her eyes. See? He remembers I saved him, she said proudly. I think he does, Thomas agreed, something shifting in his expression as he watched his granddaughter with the dog. It was as if a long-frozen part of him was beginning to thaw, mirroring Max's own recovery. The moment was interrupted by the sound of tires on the snow-covered driveway. Thomas moved to the window, his body tensing as he peered outside. Sheriff's Department, he announced, his voice suddenly cold again. Sheriff Miller himself. Mark joined him at the window. A police SUV with the Timber County Sheriff's emblem on its door had pulled up, and a heavy-set man in a tan uniform was making his way toward the cabin. Does he normally check on you after storms? Mark asked. Never, Thomas replied grimly. Something else brought him here today. He turned to Emma. Take Max into my bedroom and stay there until I come get you. Don't make a sound. Emma looked ready to protest, but the seriousness in her grandfather's face convinced her. She gently guided Max toward the bedroom, the dog moving slowly but obediently at her side. Once they were out of sight, Thomas turned to Mark. Not a word about finding a police dog. As far as Sheriff Miller is concerned, you got caught in the storm. I took you in, and that's all there is to it. Understood? Mark nodded, though he didn't fully understand the old man's caution. They were talking about an animal rescue, after all, not a criminal conspiracy. But as Sheriff Robert Miller's imposing figure filled the doorway moments later, his cold eyes sweeping the cabin with calculated precision, Mark began to sense that in Timber Lake, the line between the two might be thinner than he'd imagined. Well, Thomas, the sheriff drawled, removing his hat but not his gloves. I heard you had visitors. Thought I'd check everything was in order. Thomas's face revealed nothing. As you can see, Sheriff, everything's fine. Just offering shelter from the storm. Miller's gaze lingered on the blankets and medical supplies still scattered near the fireplace. Quite the first aid station you've got set up, he observed. Someone get hurt? Just taking precautions. Thomas replied evenly. Frostbite's no joke in weather like this. The sheriff nodded slowly, but his eyes continued to scan the room as if searching for something or someone not immediately visible. And in that moment, Mark realized that their simple act of mercy had set in motion events that none of them could have anticipated. Events that would test a child's courage, an old man's redemption, and a community's long-buried secrets. Sheriff Miller's presence seemed to drop the temperature in the cabin by 10 degrees, despite the crackling fire. His eyes narrowed as he took another step inside, boots tracking snow onto the wooden floor. Strange time for visitors, Thomas, especially with all the county roads closed. He nodded toward Mark. You from around here? Just passing through, Mark replied, trying to keep his voice casual. Taking Emma to her grandfather when the storm hit. We got stuck about half a mile down the road. He gestured vaguely toward the window. Emma? The sheriff's eyebrows raised slightly. That would be your granddaughter, Thomas? The one I heard was coming to live with you? He glanced around the room. Where is she? Before Thomas could answer, a soft thump came from the bedroom, followed by a barely audible shushing sound. Miller's head swiveled toward the noise, like a predator catching a scent. Sounds like you've got someone else here. My granddaughter's resting, Thomas said, stepping subtly to block the hallway. She's had a rough journey. I should say hello, Miller insisted, his smile not reaching his eyes. Being the sheriff and all, make her feel welcome to our community. The standoff lasted only seconds, but the tension stretched it into an eternity. Then, the bedroom door opened, and Emma appeared in the hallway. She'd positioned herself strategically so that the door blocked any view of the room behind her. Hello, she said simply, her small face solemn as she regarded the uniformed man. Sheriff Miller's expression softened into something that might pass for warmth to those who didn't look too closely. Well, hello there, young lady. I'm Sheriff Miller. Welcome to Timber Lake. He took a step toward her, but Emma didn't move, effectively preventing him from seeing past her. Thank you, she replied politely but without enthusiasm. Miller glanced at Thomas, then back to the child. You settling in okay with your grandfather? Emma nodded. We're fine, thank you. Her tone carried a dismissal that would have been comical coming from someone so small if the situation weren't so tense. The sheriff cleared his throat, wrong-footed by the child's composure. Well, that's good to hear. Tell you what, I'll send a tow truck out to get your vehicle once the roads are cleared. He turned to Thomas. Oh, before I forget, there's been some concern about wild animals in the area. Folks have reported hearing strange noises at night. Could be wolves, could be something else. You see or hear anything unusual, you give my office a call, you hear? Of course, Thomas replied evenly, though the only unusual thing I've seen lately is the sheriff making house calls after a blizzard. Miller's smile turned frigid. Just doing my job, Thomas. Community safety and all that. He glanced once more toward Emma and the partially obscured bedroom before settling his hat back on his head. You folks have a good day now. The three of them remained frozen in place until the sound of the sheriff's vehicle faded into the distance. Only then did Thomas let out a long breath. Come on out, Max, he called softly. The German shepherd limped into the living room, his ears flat against his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Emma immediately went to him, placing a calming hand on his back. He didn't like the sheriff, she observed. He got all tense when he heard his voice. Thomas and Mark exchanged significant looks. Animals sense things, Thomas said carefully. And Max isn't just any animal. He's trained to detect trouble. And criminals, Mark added. Police dogs can recognize suspects by scent. Emma looked between them, her young mind connecting dots with unsettling clarity. Does that mean Sheriff Miller is a bad person? Is that why Max doesn't like him? It means we need to be careful, Thomas replied, kneeling to examine the dog more closely. Max is trying to tell us something, and I think it's time we started listening. The storm's passing brought clear skies and bitterly cold temperatures to Timber Lake. The county plows cleared the main roads by mid-afternoon, and Mark's SUV was rescued from its snowy prison by a local tow service. With transportation restored, they now had the means to investigate further, though exactly how to proceed remained unclear. Thomas was adamant that involving official channels would be futile at best and dangerous at worst. Sheriff Miller has this county locked down tight, he explained as they sat around the kitchen table, speaking in hushed tones, though there was no one to overhear. The last person who tried to stand up to him was James Williams, Max's handler. Look how that turned out. So what do we do? Mark asked, glancing at Emma, who sat on the floor nearby, brushing Max's coat with gentle strokes. The dog had made remarkable progress in just 24 hours, now able to walk slowly around the cabin and eat regular meals. His eyes, once dull with pain and hopelessness, now followed Emma with devoted attention. I may know someone who can help, Thomas said after a thoughtful pause. Sarah Johnson. She's the doctor in town. She was close to James Williams before his accident. She might know more about what he was investigating. And you think she'd talk to us? Mark asked skeptically. She's helped me treat abandoned animals before, Thomas replied. She has her suspicions about what's going on, same as me. What is going on? Emma asked suddenly, looking up from her grooming duties. Why would someone want to hurt Max and the other animals? The men fell silent, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Finally, Thomas sighed and spoke directly to his granddaughter. "Emma, sometimes people do terrible things to animals because they're afraid the animals know their secrets, and sometimes they hurt animals to punish or frighten the people who care about them." Emma absorbed this, her young face darkening with understanding beyond her years. "Like how Max might know something about what happened to his police handler." Thomas nodded, surprised and unsettled by the child's perception. "Exactly like that." "Then we have to find out what Max knows," Emma stated with simple conviction, "to help all the other animals too." Neither man had the heart to explain how unlikely it was that they could extract specific information from a dog, no matter how intelligent. But Emma's determination sparked something in Thomas, a resolution he'd long ago abandoned. "You're right," he said, decision crystallizing in his weathered face. "And we'll start with Sarah." Dr. Sarah Johnson's clinic occupied a small building on the edge of Timberlake's modest downtown. A bell jingled as they entered the empty waiting room, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. Emma insisted that Max come with them, arguing that the dog would recognize friends of his former handler. Though Thomas had concerns about bringing such visible evidence of their investigation, he reluctantly agreed. Sarah emerged from a back room at the sound of the bell, her tired face lighting with surprise when she saw the group, particularly the German shepherd standing protectively at Emma's side. "Oh my God," she whispered, one hand rising to cover her mouth. "Is that Max?" Thomas nodded grimly. "Found him tied to a tree out on County Road 23, left to freeze to death." Sarah rushed forward, kneeling to examine the dog with professional efficiency despite the tears welling in her eyes. "I thought he died with James," she said, looking up at Thomas. "That's what Miller told everyone." "Well, he almost did die," Thomas replied. "But Emma here wouldn't let that happen." Sarah smiled at the little girl, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "You saved him?" When Emma nodded solemnly, Sarah continued, "Then you did something very special. Max was the best police dog in the county, and he was James's partner and best friend. Can you tell us what happened to James?" Mark asked quietly. "The accident?" Sarah's expression hardened as she stood up. She moved to the front door, flipping the sign to closed and drawing the blinds. "Not here," she said in a low voice. "Meet me at the old boathouse by Miller's Creek in an hour. And be careful, eyes are everywhere in this town." The boathouse sat at the edge of a frozen lake, its weathered boards gray against the pristine snow. Inside it smelled of damp wood and old fishing gear, but it offered privacy, a commodity increasingly rare in Timberlake. Sarah was already waiting when they arrived, pacing nervously between stacks of canoes and kayaks stored for the winter. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come," she said as they entered, Max limping ahead of the group as if he knew exactly where they were going. "Had to be sure we weren't followed," Thomas explained. "Now, tell us about James." Sarah's story poured out in a rush, as if she'd been holding it back for months. James Williams had begun investigating a series of anonymous tips about illegal activities in Timberlake, dogfighting rings operating on the outskirts of the county, with connections to more serious crimes like drug trafficking. His inquiries had led him to some uncomfortable places, including properties owned by prominent community members. "The night before his accident, he called me," Sarah said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "He said Max had alerted to something at the old Carlson property. That's an abandoned farm about 10 miles outside town. James said he'd found evidence and was going to call in state investigators the next morning. But he never made it to morning," Thomas guessed. Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. "His patrol car went off Ravine Road. They said the ice made him lose control, but James knew those roads like the back of his hand. And there were strange marks on the guardrail that didn't match up with the damage to his vehicle." "And Max?" Mark prompted. "Sheriff Miller said Max was in the car with James when it went over," Sarah replied. "But they never found his body. I thought—" She shook her head, gazing at the German shepherd with wonder. "I can't believe he's alive." "He was meant to die," Emma said quietly, kneeling beside Max. "But he didn't. He stayed alive to tell what happened." The adults fell silent, the child's words hanging in the air like a prophecy. Max nudged Emma's hand with his nose, then turned toward the boathouse door, ears perked and alert. "Someone's coming," Thomas warned, moving to peer through a grimy window. Outside, a police SUV had pulled up beside their vehicle. Sheriff Miller stepped out, followed by 2 deputies. He stood for a moment, surveying the boathouse with narrowed eyes before starting toward it with purposeful strides. "It's Miller," Thomas hissed. "We need to get out of here." "There's a back door," Sarah said, pointing to the rear of the building. "It leads out onto the lake. If the ice is thick enough—" "We can't risk Emma on the ice," Mark objected. "We can't risk her with Miller either," Thomas countered grimly. "Not with what we know now." The choice was made for them when the front door rattled against its rusty latch. "Dr. Johnson," Miller's voice carried through the wooden walls. "I know you're in there. Open up, official police business." Sarah led them quickly to the rear exit, a small door half hidden behind stacked life preservers. "The ice should hold if you stay near the shore," she whispered. "Get to the old hunting cabin on the north side. It's about half a mile through those trees." She pointed across the frozen lake to a distant stand of pines. "What about you?" Thomas asked. "I'll stall them," she replied, her face set with determination. "Now go." They slipped through the door onto the snow-covered ice, just as the sound of splintering wood announced Miller's forced entry into the boathouse. Thomas led the way, one hand gripping Emma's while Mark followed with Max, supporting the dog when his weakened legs struggled on the slippery surface. Behind them they could hear raised voices, Sarah's indignant protests and Miller's increasingly angry demands. Then came a shout that chilled them more than the winter air. "They've gone out the back, on the ice." Thomas turned to see Miller and his deputies emerging from the boathouse, their attention fixed on the 4 figures making their slow way across the frozen lake. "Run," he urged, but Emma's short legs and Max's condition made speed impossible. They were exposed and vulnerable on the open ice, sitting ducks for the approaching officers. That's when Max, drawing on reserves of strength none of them knew he possessed, surged ahead of the group. He turned to face the approaching threat, planted his feet firmly on the ice, and let out a deep, resonant bark that echoed across the frozen landscape. It was not the weak sound of a recovering invalid, but the authoritative command of a trained police dog, an officer defending his charges. The sound stopped Miller in his tracks, an expression of disbelief and something like fear crossing his face as he recognized the German shepherd he'd thought dead. In that moment of hesitation, a new sound joined the tableau, the wail of approaching sirens, multiple vehicles by the sound of it, converging on the lakeside from the direction of the main road. "State Police," someone shouted through a megaphone. "Sheriff Miller, remain where you are. You and your deputies are surrounded." The tableau on the ice froze as every head turned toward the new arrivals. A line of marked state police vehicles forming a blockade at the edge of the lake, uniformed officers taking up positions with weapons drawn. And in that frozen moment, Emma knelt beside Max on the ice, her arms encircling his neck as she whispered into his ear, "You did it, Max. You brought help. You saved us all." The state police intervention created a momentary tableau on the frozen lake. Sheriff Miller and his deputies frozen in their tracks, Thomas and Mark standing protectively near Emma and Max, and the line of officers with weapons drawn creating a perimeter around the scene. The winter sun cast long shadows across the ice, the tension as brittle as the frozen surface beneath their feet. Then chaos erupted. Sheriff Miller, realizing he was cornered, made a desperate decision. He lunged forward, drawing his weapon and shouting, "This is my jurisdiction. Stand down." His deputies hesitated, caught between loyalty to their sheriff and the overwhelming state police presence. "Robert Miller, you are under investigation for corruption, evidence tampering, and the suspicious death of Deputy James Williams," announced a stern-voiced state police captain through his megaphone. "Lower your weapon and surrender peacefully." Miller's face contorted with rage and desperation. "This is a setup," he shouted, his gun wavering between the state police and the small group on the ice. "These people are interfering with an ongoing investigation." Thomas pushed Emma behind him, shielding her with his body while keeping a firm grip on Max's collar. The German shepherd strained forward, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest as he fixed his gaze on the sheriff. Despite his weakened condition, the police training embedded in his muscles and memory had taken over. He recognized a threat and was prepared to defend his people. "It's over, Miller," Thomas called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "They know everything." Miller's eyes darted wildly, the calculation of a cornered predator visible in his expression. Then his gaze settled on Emma, partially visible behind Thomas's protective stance. "You," he snarled. "This is all because of you and that damn dog." What happened next occurred with terrifying speed. Miller lunged forward, his intention clearly to grab either Emma or Max as leverage. Mark moved to intercept him, but his feet slipped on the ice. Max broke free from Thomas's grip with surprising strength, launching himself at Miller with a ferocious bark. The sheriff's gun discharged with a crack that echoed across the frozen lake. Max collapsed mid-leap, his body sliding across the ice, leaving a crimson trail in his wake. Emma's scream pierced the winter air as state police officers rushed forward, tackling Miller and his deputies to the ice. "Max!" Emma broke from Thomas's protection, dropping to her knees beside the fallen dog. Blood spread rapidly beneath him, turning the white ice into a scarlet pool. "Grandpa, help him. Please help him." Thomas was already beside her, his hands moving with professional urgency as he assessed the wound. "Shoulder hit, possibly the lung," he muttered, pressing his scarf against the bleeding. "He needs immediate medical attention." The state police captain approached, holstering his weapon. "We have an emergency vehicle standing by. We can transport the dog to a veterinary facility." "No time," Thomas snapped. "My cabin is closer, and I have supplies. I was a veterinarian for 40 years. The captain nodded. "We'll escort you. Our paramedic can assist." Everything blurred into frantic motion. Max was carefully lifted onto a backboard, his breathing shallow and labored, blood soaking through the makeshift bandages. Emma refused to leave his side, her small hands pressed against his fur, tears streaming down her face as she whispered repeatedly, "Stay with me, Max. Please stay with me." The journey back to Thomas's cabin passed in a haze of sirens and urgent voices. Sarah Johnson met them there, having been released by the state police after briefly being detained as a witness. She immediately joined Thomas in converting the kitchen table into an emergency operating station, laying out sterilized instruments and medication with practiced efficiency. "Emma, you need to wait in the other room," Thomas instructed gently as they prepared to operate on Max. "No." Emma's face was pale but determined, her hands still pressed against Max's blood-soaked fur. "He needs me. He stayed with me when I was scared. I have to stay with him." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. In normal circumstances, a child would never be allowed to witness emergency surgery, but these were far from normal circumstances. And there was something in Emma's expression, a fierce, protective determination that transcended her years, that made Thomas reconsider. "All right," he conceded. "But you stand at his head, away from the wound. Talk to him, keep him calm. Can you do that?" Emma nodded solemnly, moving to position herself where she could stroke Max's head and whisper into his ear while staying clear of the medical procedures. What followed was a grueling 2-hour battle to save Max's life. The bullet had pierced his shoulder and nicked the edge of his lung, causing dangerous internal bleeding. Thomas worked with the focused intensity of a man half his age, his hands steady as he extracted bullet fragments, repaired damaged tissue, and fought to stabilize the dog's failing systems. Mark paced the living room, answering questions from state police investigators who had arrived to take statements. The story emerged in fragments. James Williams's investigation into animal cruelty and dogfighting, his discovery of links to Sheriff Miller and several wealthy landowners in the county, the suspicious accident that claimed his life, and the subsequent attempt to eliminate his canine partner, the only witness to what really happened that night. Williams suspected Miller was taking payoffs to ignore the dogfighting rings, explained Captain Anderson, the lead state police investigator. "We've been building a case for months, but we needed solid evidence connecting Miller directly to Williams's death. And finding Max alive provides that connection?" Mark asked. "It gives us probable cause for search warrants," Anderson confirmed. Max was officially reported deceased in Williams's accident report, signed by Miller himself. finding him alive, deliberately abandoned to die, blows the cover up wide open. In the kitchen, Max's condition deteriorated despite Thomas and Sarah's best efforts. His breathing became increasingly labored, his pulse weak and erratic. Blood continued to seep through the sutures faster than they could replace it. "We're losing him," Sarah murmured, reaching for another packet of artificial plasma. Thomas shook his head, frustration etching deeper lines in his weathered face. "His body's too weak from the previous trauma. He doesn't have the reserves to fight this." Emma, who had been whispering continuously to Max throughout the procedure, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "He can't die," she said, her voice breaking. "He survived being left in the snow. He survived until I found him. He can't die now." Thomas felt a painful constriction in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the surgery. This small girl, who had already lost her mother, was now facing the loss of the creature who had somehow connected with her broken heart, and Max, who had endured unimaginable suffering, only to be shot the moment he found safety. The injustice of it was almost unbearable. "We're doing everything we can, Emma," he said, the professional detachment he'd maintained for decades cracking under the weight of his granddaughter's pain. Outside, the winter sun began to set, casting the cabin in deepening shadows as the medical team fought their increasingly desperate battle. State police officers came and went, securing evidence, taking photographs, establishing a protective perimeter around the property. The news had spread through the small community that Sheriff Miller had been arrested and that Thomas Wilson's granddaughter had somehow been involved in uncovering a county-wide conspiracy. As darkness fell, Thomas was forced to confront a bitter reality. "His heart's failing," he told Sarah quietly, his voice pitched low so Emma wouldn't hear. "We've done everything medically possible." Sarah glanced at Emma, who had fallen into exhausted sleep, her head resting against Max's neck, one small hand still tangled in his fur. "Should we wake her? To say goodbye?" Thomas hesitated, years of professional detachment warring with newfound grandfatherly instinct. Before he could decide, Max's monitor emitted the steady, unbroken tone that every medical professional dreads. "Flatline." "No, no, no," Thomas muttered, immediately beginning chest compressions. "Come on, Max, don't do this." The commotion woke Emma, who took in the situation with a child's unerring instinct for catastrophe. "What's happening? Is he dying?" "Emma, I need you to step back," Sarah said gently, moving to guide the child away. "No." Emma broke free, throwing herself across Max's still form. "Max, wake up! Please wake up! You have to stay with me." Her small body shook with sobs as she pressed her face against the dog's neck. "I need you. Please don't go." Thomas continued CPR mechanically, knowing it was futile but unable to stop while Emma watched. Sarah stood by helplessly, tears streaming down her own face. In the doorway, Mark and Captain Anderson observed the scene in respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing not just the death of a dog, but the shattering of a fragile child's newly formed bond. "Time of death, 6:42 p.m., Thomas finally said, his voice hollow as he stepped back from the table, removing his blood-stained gloves with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Emma. We did everything we could." Emma looked up at him, her small face devastated by a grief too large for her young heart to contain. "He saved me," she whispered. "In the snow, he saved me. Even though he was hurt and scared, he made me brave. And now?" Her voice broke on a sob too painful to voice. Thomas gathered his granddaughter into his arms, holding her tightly as she wept against his chest. His own tears fell silently into her hair as he confronted a bitter truth. In his determination to expose the corruption that had poisoned his community, he had inadvertently led his granddaughter to another devastating loss. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, rocking her gently. "So very sorry." The cabin fell into heavy silence, broken only by Emma's heartbroken sobs and the muffled voices of police officers outside. Justice had been set in motion. Sheriff Miller and his associates would face charges for their crimes. The dogfighting rings would be dismantled. The community might eventually heal. But in this moment, none of that mattered. A child wept for her dog, and no measure of justice could fill the hollow space his death had carved within her. As Thomas held his granddaughter, he found himself making a silent vow to the dog who had brought them together, and then been torn away. Max's sacrifice would not be in vain. Somehow Thomas would find a way to help Emma heal from this loss, to honor Max's memory, and to rebuild the trust that had been so cruelly shattered. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the blood-stained path to the cabin in a clean white blanket, nature's own attempt to erase the evidence of the day's tragedy. But some marks could not be so easily erased. They etched themselves into the heart, becoming part of who you are and who you might become. The cabin fell into a profound silence after Max flatlined. Emma's sobs had quieted to occasional hiccups as exhaustion overtook her grief. Thomas sat beside her on the sofa, one arm around her small shoulders, his own face etched with lines of sorrow and fatigue. Sarah moved quietly around the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of their failed medical intervention, while Mark conferred in low tones with Captain Anderson near the door. "We should move the body," Sarah said softly to Thomas, "before Emma wakes up." Thomas nodded warily, rising from the sofa. "I'll wrap him in a blanket. We can put him in the shed until—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of burying Max in the frozen ground seemed like a final insult to the brave dog who had endured so much. As Thomas approached the kitchen table where Max's still form lay, Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I know you did everything possible." He nodded again, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Together, they began to arrange a blanket beside the table, preparing to transfer Max's body. The cabin was so quiet that when the sound came, a soft, almost imperceptible whine, everyone froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Thomas turned slowly toward the table. For a moment, nothing happened, and he thought he'd imagined it. Then Max's chest rose slightly, an almost invisible movement, but unmistakable to Thomas's trained eye. "My God," he breathed, rushing to place his stethoscope against the dog's chest. The rhythm he detected was faint and irregular, but undeniably present. "He's alive, Sarah. Get the adrenaline." What followed was a flurry of desperate activity as Thomas and Sarah fought to stabilize Max's tentative hold on life. Thomas administered cardiac stimulants, while Sarah prepared intravenous fluids, both working with the focused intensity of medical professionals facing a critical emergency. "What's happening?" Emma had awakened, watching wide-eyed from the doorway. Mark moved to her side, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Max is fighting, Emma. He's not giving up." Emma broke free, rushing to the table where she could see Max's chest now visibly rising and falling, his breathing shallow but persistent. "I knew it," she whispered, her face transforming with hope. "I knew he wouldn't leave me." Over the next hour, Max's condition gradually stabilized. His heartbeat strengthened, his breathing deepened, and occasionally his eyelids fluttered, though he remained unconscious. Thomas worked tirelessly, drawing on every scrap of veterinary knowledge accumulated over his long career. "It's a miracle," Sarah said as they finally stepped back, both exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "It's determination," Thomas corrected, watching as Emma gently stroked Max's head. "His and hers. I've never seen such a will to live." Captain Anderson, who had observed the medical drama with quiet respect, stepped forward. "Dr. Wilson, now that the immediate crisis has passed, I need to update you on developments. We've executed search warrants on Sheriff Miller's home and office based on the evidence you've provided. What we've found—" He shook his head, his expression grim. "It's worse than we imagined." In the early hours of the morning, as Max continued his improbable recovery, the full extent of Sheriff Miller's corruption began to emerge. The state police had discovered detailed records hidden in a safe behind Miller's office wall. Documentation of payments from wealthy landowners to ignore the dogfighting operations, evidence of narcotics trafficking through the county, and most damning of all, a dashcam video that had been removed from Deputy Williams's patrol car after his accident. The video shows Miller's vehicle forcing Williams off the road, Captain Anderson explained, spreading photographs across Thomas's dining table. Williams had gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation, and Miller couldn't let that happen. "And Max?" Thomas asked, glancing toward the kitchen where Emma remained vigilantly at the dog's side. "Max was in the car with Williams that night, but somehow survived the crash. We believe Miller thought the dog had died in the wreckage, but Max must have crawled away. When Miller realized a trained police dog was still out there, a dog that could identify him as being at the scene, he organized a search. That's why Max was tied to that tree, Mark interjected, the pieces finally coming together. They found him and left him to die where no one would find him. Anderson nodded. Exactly. And they would have succeeded if not for a snowstorm and a determined little girl. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, bringing weak winter sunlight through the cabin windows, the investigation continued to expand. More state police arrived, along with FBI agents specializing in corruption cases. The small cabin became the unlikely command center for an operation that would eventually encompass 3 counties and implicate dozens of officials and prominent citizens. Through it all, Emma remained at Max's side, talking to him constantly, sharing stories about her mother and her life before coming to Timber Lake. Around mid-morning, as she was describing her former home's garden, Max's eyes opened fully for the first time since the shooting. He looked directly at Emma, his gaze clear and focused. "Grandpa," she called excitedly. "He's awake. Max is really awake." Thomas hurried to examine the dog, amazed at the improvement in his vital signs. "Extraordinary," he murmured, checking the wound site. "The bleeding has stopped completely, and there's no sign of infection." Max's gaze never left Emma's face, and when she placed her small hand on his paw, his tail thumped weakly against the table. Something passed between them. A connection that transcended words, an understanding that they had saved each other in ways that went beyond the physical. As the day progressed, revelations continued to rock the small community of Timber Lake. Mark, who had been increasingly quiet and withdrawn as the investigation unfolded, finally approached Thomas while Emma was napping beside Max. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his face drawn with guilt. "I wasn't just passing through when I brought Emma here." He took a deep breath. "I used to work for one of the men involved in Miller's operation, Calvin Hayes. I did maintenance at his property, and I saw things. The fighting pits, the training areas, the injured dogs that disappeared." Thomas stared at him, a cold anger building in his chest. "You knew about this?" Mark nodded miserably. "Not the extent of it, not Miller's involvement or Williams's death. But enough that I should have reported it. I was afraid. Hayes made it clear what happened to people who talked." He glanced toward Emma. "When the Social Services Agency asked for someone to drive Emma here, Hayes suggested me. I think he wanted me to report back on you, Thomas. There were rumors you knew too much." "So you used my granddaughter as cover?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "Initially, yes," Mark admitted. "But then we found Max, and I saw how Emma responded to him, and—" he struggled to find the words. "Something changed. I couldn't be part of it anymore. That's why I helped you, why I stayed. I want to make it right." Before Thomas could respond, Captain Anderson approached, having overheard part of the conversation. "Mr. Peterson, we'll need your statement on record. The information you have could be crucial to building our case." Mark nodded, accepting the inevitable consequences of his confession. "I'll tell you everything I know, about Hayes, about the other properties, about the dogfighting network. All of it." As Mark was led away to give his official statement, Emma stirred from her nap. She looked first to Max, ensuring he was still beside her, then turned to her grandfather with sleepy confusion. "Where's Mr. Peterson going?" Thomas sat beside her, searching for words that would make sense to a child. Mark had some important information to share with the police. He's helping them understand what happened to Max and the other dogs. Emma considered this. Was Mr. Peterson one of the bad people? Thomas hesitated, the moral complexity of the situation difficult to distill for a 6-year-old. "He made some bad choices," he said finally. "But when it really mattered, he made a good choice. He helped us save Max, and now he's helping save other dogs too." This explanation seemed to satisfy Emma, who turned her attention back to Max. The German Shepherd had improved remarkably over the past hours, now able to lift his head and respond to simple commands. His eyes followed Emma's every movement with devoted attention. By late afternoon, news of the corruption scandal had spread throughout Timber Lake and beyond. Reporters gathered at the end of Thomas's driveway, held back by state police officers maintaining a protective perimeter around the property. Neighbors arrived with food, blankets, and offers of assistance. Their shock at the revelations mingled with determination to support the man and child who had exposed the truth. Dr. Sarah Johnson returned from the clinic with additional medical supplies for Max, her car navigating through the crowd of townsfolk with difficulty. "It's crazy out there," she reported, stamping snow from her boots in the entryway. "Everyone's talking about Emma and Max. They're calling her the little hero of Timber Lake." Emma, oblivious to her newfound fame, remained focused solely on Max's recovery. She had created a system of rewards for his progress. A treat when he lifted his head, gentle praise when he moved his legs, a small celebration when he managed to sit up briefly. As evening approached, Captain Anderson gathered everyone in the living room for an update. "We've arrested 12 individuals so far, including 3 county officials besides Miller and 4 prominent landowners. Calvin Hayes is in custody, along with his associates. The dog-fighting rings have been shut down, and we've rescued 27 dogs from 3 different properties." 27? Emma looked up from where she sat beside Max on his makeshift bed near the fire. Anderson nodded, his stern face softening as he addressed the child. "Yes, Emma, and it's all because you wouldn't leave Max behind in that snowstorm. Your courage started a chain of events that has saved many lives, human and animal." Emma absorbed this information, her young mind grappling with the impact of her simple act of compassion. "What will happen to the other dogs?" she asked, her arm protectively around Max's neck. "They'll be cared for by animal welfare specialists, rehabilitated, and eventually adopted to good homes," Anderson assured her. "Like Max?" Emma looked up at her grandfather, hope shining in her eyes. "Can we keep Max and give him a good home?" Thomas felt something shift inside him, a thawing of the frozen grief he'd carried for years, a recognition that this small girl and wounded dog had somehow broken through walls he'd thought impenetrable. "Yes," he said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Max belongs with us now. We're his family." As night fell once more over the snow-covered landscape, the cabin settled into a tentative peace. State police maintained their presence outside, but the frantic activity of investigation had subsided into methodical evidence gathering. Max rested more comfortably, his condition continuing to improve under Thomas and Sarah's vigilant care. Emma finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep on the sofa, with her hands still reaching toward Max's bed. Thomas covered her with a blanket, then sat in the old armchair facing the fire. The events of the past 48 hours had transformed everything: his solitary existence, his relationship with his granddaughter, his standing in the community, even his long-dormant sense of purpose. All because a child had refused to abandon a suffering animal in a snowstorm. "You know," Sarah said softly, joining him by the fire, "there's a word for what happened here. Not just justice or truth, but redemption." Thomas nodded, watching the interplay of light and shadow across his granddaughter's sleeping face. "For Max, for Emma," he paused, feeling the weight of years lifting slightly from his shoulders, "and maybe for me too." Spring came early to Timber Lake that year, as if nature itself was eager to heal the wounds of a difficult winter. The snow retreated gradually, revealing muddy earth that would soon give way to green shoots and wildflowers. 3 months had passed since the dramatic events that had exposed corruption and cruelty in the quiet Minnesota community, and the landscape of justice had evolved alongside the changing seasons. In the federal courthouse in St. Paul, Judge Eleanor Montgomery brought down her gavel, concluding the sentencing hearing for former Sheriff Robert Miller. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the crimes of corruption, conspiracy to commit murder, animal cruelty, obstruction of justice, and the vehicular homicide of Deputy James Williams." Her stern gaze swept the courtroom where journalists, local citizens, and law enforcement officials had gathered to witness the conclusion of a case that had shocked the state. Among those present was Thomas Wilson, sitting ramrod straight in a crisp suit that contrasted with his usual casual attire. Beside him sat Dr. Sarah Johnson, who reached over to squeeze his hand as the sentence was pronounced. They exchanged a glance heavy with meaning: relief, vindication, and the bittersweet knowledge that justice, while served, could not restore all that had been lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Thomas and Sarah as they descended the steps. "Dr. Wilson, how do you feel about today's verdict?" called out a journalist from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. James Williams was a good man who died trying to protect his community from those sworn to serve it. No prison sentence can bring him back, but perhaps today's ruling will help ensure that such a betrayal of public trust never happens again in Timber Lake. Back in the small community, transformation was evident beyond the criminal proceedings. The exposure of the dogfighting ring and its connections to local officials had prompted soul-searching among residents who had turned blind eyes to suspicious activities. Community meetings had led to the establishment of an animal welfare committee, stricter ordinances regarding the treatment of animals, and a volunteer network to monitor and report potential abuse cases. At the heart of these changes was Emma Wilson, whose simple act of compassion had sparked a movement. Though only 6 years old, she had become a symbol of moral courage that adults in the community sought to emulate. Local schools had instituted a Be Like Emma program, encouraging children to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing and to show kindness to animals in need. The most visible sign of Emma's influence could be found at the edge of town, where the old Anderson property, once abandoned and dilapidated, had been transformed into the Timber Lake Animal Sanctuary. Using funds seized from the criminal network and donations from community members, the property now housed rehabilitation facilities for rescued animals and educational programs for local children. On a warm Saturday morning in April, Thomas and Emma stood before a small gathered crowd at the sanctuary's official opening ceremony. Max sat beside them, his posture alert and proud despite the faint scar still visible on his shoulder. His recovery had been remarkable, his strength returning week by week until he was once again the powerful, confident German Shepherd he had been before his ordeal. Today, we not only open a sanctuary for animals in need, Thomas addressed the audience, his voice stronger and more assured than it had been in years, but we also commemorate the human and animal partnerships that protect our community. This facility will stand as a living memorial to Deputy James Williams and his canine partner, Max, whose courage and loyalty have taught us all about true service. Emma stepped forward when her grandfather nodded, her small face solemn with the responsibility entrusted to her. "Animals are our friends," she said simply. "They help us and love us, and we should help and love them too. That's why Max and I want to cut the ribbon for our new animal home." A cheer went up as Emma, with Max at her side, approached the red ribbon stretching across the sanctuary's entrance. Using oversized ceremonial scissors that required both her hands, she cut the ribbon, while Max gave a dignified bark that many interpreted as approval. Among those applauding was Mark Peterson, his presence at the ceremony a testament to the complex nature of redemption. Following his confession and cooperation with authorities, Mark had received a reduced sentence of community service rather than imprisonment. He had devoted himself to the construction of the animal sanctuary, working tirelessly to transform the property into a safe haven for the very creatures he had once failed to protect. As the ceremony concluded and guests began touring the facility, Thomas found a quiet moment with his granddaughter and Max beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "Your mother would be very proud of you, Emma," he said softly. "I know I am." Emma leaned against him, one hand absently stroking Max's head. "Do you think she can see us?" she asked, looking up at the clear blue sky. Thomas followed her gaze, considering his answer carefully. "I believe she can," he said finally, "and I think she's happy that we found each other, all three of us." Max nudged Emma's hand with his nose, as if emphasizing the point, and she smiled, a full, unreserved expression of joy that had become increasingly common in recent months. The bond between the child and dog had only strengthened during Max's recovery, each seeming to understand the other on a level that transcended ordinary communication. 1 year to the day after Emma had spotted a dark shape against the snow from a car window, the Wilson home hosted a celebration. Friends gathered to commemorate not just Max's rescue, but the community's healing. Sarah Johnson was there, her friendship with Thomas having blossomed into something deeper over the months of shared purpose. Mark Peterson attended, accepted now as a man who had found his moral compass, albeit belatedly. Even Captain Anderson of the state police made an appearance, bringing news that the final defendant in the corruption case had pleaded guilty that morning. As twilight settled over the gathering, Emma sat on the porch steps with Max beside her, both watching the fireflies beginning to emerge in the yard. Thomas joined them, easing his aging joints onto the step. "Are you happy here, Emma?" he asked, a question that had been on his mind since the day she'd arrived during that fateful blizzard. Emma considered this with the thoughtful seriousness that characterized her approach to life. "Yes," she said finally. "I still miss Mom, but I'm not alone." She wrapped one arm around Max's neck and reached for her grandfather's hand with the other. "We saved each other, didn't we?" Thomas nodded, emotion tightening his throat as he squeezed her small hand. "That's what family does," he replied, including Max in his gaze. "We save each other every day in all the ways that matter." From the shadow of the porch, Max watched over his humans with alert devotion, his posture conveying what words could not, that he understood his purpose now was to protect this small pack, to share their journey through all seasons to come, and to embody the loyalty that had brought justice to Timberlake and healing to a fractured family. The circle was complete, the wounds of winter yielding to the promise of perpetual spring. In the winter of our lives, when the world seems coldest and most unforgiving, it is often the smallest hands that guide us back to warmth. Emma and Max's journey reminds us that age brings wisdom, but children bring clarity, seeing injustice plainly and responding with pure compassion where we might hesitate or look away. Their story speaks to the redemption that awaits those willing to open doors once firmly closed, to extend helping hands when it would be easier to remain uninvolved. Many of us, like Thomas, have built walls around our hearts after life's disappointments, only to discover that true healing begins when we allow others to breach those defenses. The courage to begin again is ageless. Whether you're 6 or 60, it's never too late to stand for what's right, to form new bonds, or to find purpose in protecting the vulnerable. In our twilight years, we are not defined by our past failures, but by our willingness to join hands with younger generations in creating a more compassionate world. One rescue, one family, one community at a time. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.